One of the really important things in reading the Old Testament is to understand that characters that we are reading about are not just historical figures. They are literary characters. They have been crafted and shaped in a particular way to get a particular point across. And it may be that the Venn diagram of overlap between the historical character and the literary figure that we read about is quite high. But ultimately, we are reading about archetypes. We're reading about symbols. We're reading about characters that are meant to speak to us then more than just a historical event. They're speaking to us about something important, about the human condition. And this is no more evident than when we look at the story of the Exodus. Egypt and Pharaoh are more than just historical figures or historical empires. They represent something about the human condition. And when we get that, it opens the Exodus story up for all of us to find ourselves in and to critique what's happening in the world around us.
I remember way back in my first year of seminary, one of my professors arguing that, look, we can have all kinds of debates about the historical characters in the Bible. What was the Abraham of history like, and who was the Moses of the ancient Near East? Those questions are fun, even important to ask, but the answers are always largely going to be speculative. That's because all we can really talk about with certainty is the Abraham of the text, or the character of Moses that's preserved in the story. Now, there might be some significant overlap between the person Moses and the character Moses, but all we have available to us in biblical studies is the person on the page. Now, archaeologists, that's a different thing. They get to play in a different sandbox, so they have a different set of questions. But when it comes to biblical studies, these are literary characters that we are dealing with. And for this reason, Brueggemann prefers to see Egypt not just as a historical empire, which it certainly was, but he would say, more importantly, Egypt is a character. They're a symbol of every system that resists God's justice in the world. Likewise, the Pharaoh of the Bible, that's not just a man who sits atop a particular empire. He is an amalgamation of all those who presume to sit at the apex of human history. Brueggemann would argue that's not just a way to make the Bible relevant, it's actually inherent in the way it's written. So, for example, particular, historical, identifying characteristics about any particular Pharaoh who presided over an Exodus event, those are largely, actually conspicuously absent in the Bible. Brueggemann would say that's not an oversight, that's by design. Because the storytellers were acutely aware that this wasn't just a story about a particular Pharaoh and a unique Moses. This was a story of something that was unfolding over and over again throughout the human history. In other words, they were using the person Pharaoh to write about the phenomenon of Pharaoh, the idea of power. In fact, I used a lot of Brueggemann's work to argue that the book of Revelation, when it moves back and forth between Rome and Babylon and images of Egypt, that's not because the narrative is switching back and forth in different time periods. It's because it is explicitly following the tradition of the Hebrew prophets. It's intentionally dislocating the story from a particular time and place to speak to tendencies within the human condition. So the book of Revelation, the Hebrew prophets, the Exodus, the prophetic imagination is not about predicting the future or just narrating the past. It's about telling us the mistakes we keep on making. And so in that sense, Egypt, Babylon, Rome, Britain, America, China, whatever empire you see on the horizon, the Bible actually has something to say to all of it. And I'll read one of my favorite quotes here. Brueggemann writes, "The key pathology of our time, which seduces us all, is the reduction of our imagination so that we become too numb, too satiated, too co-opted to do the serious imaginative work of reading the Bible." It's good stories, read with prophetic creativity, that wakes us up from what is now toward what is possible. And so when we read a story like the Exodus, it's valuable, I would argue, even fascinating to study where it fits in our history, but never at the expense of seeing how the story is still unfolding all around us today. And for that, we need to get poetic. Now, Brueggemann identifies three characteristics in what he calls the royal consciousness that is embedded in the character of Egypt. He calls them affluence, amnesia, and numbness. Affluence, this is Egypt's wealth built on the back of the oppressed. It's Jewish slaves who make the bricks to keep their economy moving. Second is amnesia. Egypt is impervious to the lessons of the past. In fact, the story of our Pharaoh begins in Exodus 1:8, where we read, "Then a new king, whom Joseph meant nothing to, came to power over Egypt." Empires only remember who's important to them today. And then finally, this numbness. The Egypt of the Exodus suppresses grief and silences dissent, but it's not just from their slaves, it's actually from their own people when the story begins to turn against them. And that means it renders them unable to learn properly. So affluence, amnesia, numbness, these are problems we see in empires all around us today.